All right, we are live for another reading, and this will be some portions of Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, 1930s Christian Philosophy Debates in France. Looks like we've already got 9 people here, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we'll do. It's been a little bit of a time since we had one of these readings. And then I'm going to jump right into the text itself. So I've been doing some readings of portions of this work, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, which is a 2011 text, mostly comprised of translations from key documents of the Christian philosophy debates that took place in French-speaking venues. Not everybody involved was actually French, but took place between about 1931 to 1935, 1936. And we're still in the long historical introduction that I wrote to it before we get to the actual meat. Today, we're going to go over the 2 sections, Philosophy in a Christian State, Jacques Maritain, and then Catholic Philosophy, Maurice Blondel. So about 15 pages or so of the text. And then I will take questions, address comments, anything like that we want to have in the chat. So no further ado, let me get started. Philosophy in a Christian State, Jacques Maritain. 2 main features mark Maritain's involvements in the debates: a continuity of progressive development of his position and critical engagement of opposed positions. His 1933 essay on Christian philosophy represents a culmination of studies, beginning with Maritain's contribution to the 1931 Société Française de Philosophie session, which he reworked and expanded into the 1932 De la Notion de la Philosophie Chrétienne, and then incorporated into the essay. He later re-examined the issue of Christian philosophy in his 1935 book, Science and Wisdom. Since his essay in Science and Wisdom have long been available in translation and studied in depth, here I restrict myself to several main themes of 2 earlier documents. From the start, Maritain aligns his position closely with Gilson's, but works it out and presents it through a much more explicitly Thomist framework and vocabulary. He signals his agreement, this is a quote, on what is essential in this debate and accepts the way in which Gilson envisages the problem and indicates its solution. And then he adds that by bringing the problem back onto the plane of history, I think that he did not mean to suppress the theoretical question, but on the contrary, to leave it open. Accordingly, Maritain intentionally focuses on providing such a theoretical account, later explaining that while Gilson deliberately sets himself in the historical point of view, I would like to bring together the elements of a solution of a doctrinal order. This solution centers on what he calls the classical distinction between the order of specification and the order of exercise, or, as Maritain reformulates it, the distinction between the nature of philosophy, of what philosophy is in itself, and the state in which it is found factually, historically, in the human subject, and which pertains to its conditions of existence and exercise in the concrete. Although philosophy's essence or nature must be considered by means of abstraction, since it nowhere exists in concrete actuality, it possesses definite features that Thomas Aquinas determined, construing philosophical wisdom as the perfected work of reason, perfectum opus rationis, and affirming the essential naturality or rationality of philosophy. In Thomist philosophy, considered in what constitutes it formally as philosophy, no argument proceeding from faith penetrates into its texture. It derives intrinsically from reason and rational critique alone. It retains its soundness as philosophy only from experiential or intellectual evidence and from demonstration. In its nature, philosophy is specified by its formal object, which is, quote, an entire order of objects from their very nature, the soi in French, accessible to the human mind's natural powers. objects about which Maritain makes two seemingly offhand but important remarks. First, these objects are in the realm of the real, so that philosophy by its own abstract essence is called to engage with reality, not merely abstractions. Second, the reality includes both created and uncreated being. Philosophy actually exists in concrete historical reality only in conditions of exercises or states. In its real instantiation, a number of things condition philosophy, particularly the philosophizing human subjects themselves and the ways, conditions, and institutions in which they philosophize, which Maritain calls a regime. In terms of its state, philosophy can legitimately be Christian and develops further towards the potential of philosophy's essence, both as a habitus in human subjects and in the corresponding form of systems of knowledge. Christianity does this in two main fashions: by making objective contributions that philosophy then appropriates through its own proper activity, and by producing subjective reinforcements in the Christian philosopher. These both, Maritain later notes, comprise orders equally needed for philosophy in an organic Christian regime in normatively required proportioning to each other. Objective contributions take a number of forms. First, there are objects that from their very nature belong to philosophy's domain, but that philosophers did not, in fact, explicitly recognize, and that Christian revelation is sent in plain view. For example, creation ex nihilo, or God as being. Second, there are objects that philosophy knew well, but about which it hesitated a great deal, which Christianity confirms for the philosopher. An example is a trust in reason's value. Third, there are supernatural mysteries philosophy cannot itself on its own grasp, but philosophy's scope and its understanding of the divine is expanded when it cooperates with theology in a Christian regime. One product of this process, Maritain suggests, is the metaphysical problem of the person, fructified by theological meditation on the Trinity and the Incarnation. Subjective reinforcement's efficacy derives from philosophy being an intellectual habitus of the human subject, enmeshed in a spiritual matrix with other habituses as well as all the other determinate components and determinations of human beings, thus requiring for its full development, as Maritain says, many rectifications and purifications from the individual, and ascesis not only of reason, but of the heart. Higher virtues, for example, faith and intellectual habituses, for example, contemplation, strengthen and purify the habitus of philosophy, developing and operating in and through the person. In the human subject who recognizes the higher value of superior wisdoms afforded by Christianity and thus orients philosophy toward and by them, its condition in the subject is fundamentally changed. In interests of brevity, I deliberately pass over Maritain's justification for treating practical or moral philosophy differently than speculative philosophy, except to make three observations. First, in Maritain's position on Christian philosophy, speculative philosophy furnishes the paradigm for relations with Christianity. Second, in Christian practical philosophy or moral philosophy adequately considered, philosophy becomes explicitly subalternated to Christian theology in a way inadmissible for speculative philosophy. Third, Maritain's distinctions drew criticisms from two opposed directions: neo-scholastics who held him wrong to subordinate moral philosophy to theology, and Antonin Sertillange, who contended that what Maritain argues for moral philosophy ought to be applied to philosophy as a whole. All right, the next section, Catholic philosophy, Maurice Blondel. Over the course of the debates, Blondel refines and expands his own position, one from the start quite complex and difficult to summarize for several reasons. One reason that hopefully sets others in a more intelligible context is that his position on Christian philosophy develops in essential continuity with his own systematic philosophy of action, both as an application of that philosophy and as a restatement of its fundamental themes and motives. Rendering matters still more complex is that in 1934, while still engaged in the Christian philosophy debates, Blondel began to bring out his awaited, long meditated upon, and massive 5 volumes trilogy consisting of La Pensée, L'Être et les Êtres, and L'Action, substantially reworking the earlier philosophy of Action 1893. One explicit project structuring Blondel's entire philosophical work was generating a philosophy that would be both rigorously philosophical and not only open to Christianity, but determinately Christian, an integral philosophy in an integral Christianity. In his early view, a position that he later softens, no such Christian philosophy had been adequately developed in the past. The ongoing development of philosophical thought in modernity, while not generating philosophy adequate to its own requirements, had critically indicated philosophical weaknesses and shortcomings of both pre-modern and modern candidates for Christian philosophy. This had 3 main implications for Blondel. First, reappropriation of past philosophical systems, particularly of the Thomism ascendant in Catholic circles after Aeterni Patris, even if engaging modern thought in dialogue, would not be sufficient and risk blocking a better solution. Second, modern philosophy, Blondel would hold the same of most contemporary analytic and postmodern philosophy as well, was insufficiently philosophical, failing to consistently apply its own critical instruments and standards to itself, and to grapple with 3 fundamental and interconnected problems inevitably raised for any philosophy making claims to sufficiency to itself and to reality: the problem of human destiny, the religious problem, and the problem of the supernatural. A critical metaphilosophical approach towards philosophy itself, and as well as towards other projects of Christian philosophy and their basic claims and assumptions, is thus necessarily at the heart of the Blondelian position. So here's the next section, Blondel's 1931 engagements. His first engagements with other interlocutors on the subject of Christian philosophy were mainly critical. Blondel took on Brehier directly, examining, quote, his presuppositions, his method of discussion, and the character of his solutions, revealing their deficiencies and reliance on rationalism's own dogmatism imposing itself by authority. In this case, rationalism becomes irrational, resulting in straitjacketed philosophy and stilted history of both Christian thinkers and pre-Christian Greeks. Turning specifically to Brehier's criticisms of himself, Blondel points out that they turn out not to be not only individually untrue, but also mutually inconsistent. If his philosophy of action by itself bears no intrinsic Christian stamp or implications, then why is that work construed to be mere apologetics? Evidently, because his rationalist critic assumes the believer to inevitably start from a committed position of faith, which is then smuggled into his philosophical work. Blondel stresses that his method, which proceeds by an indirect and negative way, was deliberately developed and applied to avoid that charge. As he does to Augustine and Thomas, Brehier sets up Blondel as a straw man. His criticisms of Gilson, and by extension Maritain, criticisms in certain respects off base, set off some but not all of the basic elements of his position. He first diagnoses 2 metaphilosophical assumptions or dispositions that, quote, bar the path to the very possibility of Christian philosophy. One, which he labels conceptualism, consists in the assumption that philosophical systems and the activity of philosophy must be articulated principally through and find their finished state and mark of adequacy in concepts, organized into systems closed off to, and thus unable to account for and accept the ongoing tutelage of the concrete reality philosophy's task is to engage. What cannot be reductively transformed into concepts is rejected as non-philosophical by conceptualism. This represents a choice on the part of philosophers, not an inevitable requirement, and Blondel will advocate for the other possible option as an open philosophy or philosophy of insufficiency. The other stance, which he somewhat idiosyncratically calls historicism, bears directly on the incorporation of supernatural data into philosophy, thus on the broader problem of the relations between the natural and the supernatural orders. And Blondel's criticism targets historical solutions to the problem of Christian philosophy. The problem, reduced to its bare bones, consists in a dilemma presenting itself when any discipline oriented primarily to the order of natural phenomena and proceeding by the use of human natural endowments and their acquisitions through the ongoing work of the discipline, attempts to address itself to matters of the supernatural order without deliberately adopting the sort of critical stance provided by a philosophy of insufficiency. On the one horn of the dilemma, the supernatural data are naturalized or rationalized, rendering them amenable to incorporation into philosophical systems or historical accounts, but at the price of denaturing them, in effect, losing a grip on what is supernatural at the very same time as claiming to grasp it. On the other horn, the data's supernatural character is respected, but philosophy or history becomes vitiated by uncritically bringing into it something heterogeneous and unassimilated. The philosophical alternative to these two philosophical assumptions is exemplified by, but not restricted to, the type of philosophy Blondel attempts to produce. By philosophy of insufficiency, he means one that in the course of its exercise and systematic development thematizes philosophy's own insufficiency to fully comprehend, rationally articulate, and systematize its own objects, the ranges of realities to which it extends, and the human subject engaged in philosophizing. Such a philosophy will also acknowledge that philosophy's own intrinsic requirement of autonomy culminates in philosophy freely allowing itself to be further determined, guided, and shaped by something transcending philosophy. This is made possible by philosophy opening in itself and before itself an empty space prepared not only for its own ulterior discoveries and on its own ground, but for illuminations and contributions whose real origin it is not and cannot become. This space is not simply a blank indeterminacy, a black hole, or a chimerical fiction, projection of restlessness, sickness of the soul. It is precisely because it possesses contours to discern, a reason for being to meditate on and render rationally admissible, an attractive and imperious character, that within this space, ongoing meeting of philosophy and Christianity can legitimately occur without detriment to either. All right, the next section, Le Problème de la Philosophie Catholique. This is Blondel's book that has not yet been translated. In this 1932 work, Blondel expands his position on Christian philosophy, insisting, however, on replacing the term with Catholic philosophy. The first part of the book reprints the letter on apologetics, accompanied by his own annotations, glosses, and even retractions. In the rest of the book, he develops his position further in several ways. First, he clarifies the relationship between his critical project and Gilson's. Quote, if supernatural revelation is generative of reason, it is necessary first that we be shown how, far from stabilizing everything in closed concepts, reason discovers in itself needs that nature does not satisfy at all, something unattained, always naturally unattainable, and nevertheless incoercibly hungering for attainment. He also provides an admittedly dense formulation of the desired relationship between philosophy and Christianity, the natural and the supernatural orders. Quote, neither dependence nor independence, nor simple juxtaposition of the rational order and the Christian order, but a type of heterogeneity in compenetration and of symbiosis in the very incommensurability. He clarifies his position on concepts, assuring his critics, I do not in any way mistake the legitimate and indispensable role, the realist scope, the transcendent value of concepts. Nevertheless, He holds that concepts remain inadequate and always perfectible or deficient, so that philosophy does not terminate in them as in a resting place. It is because philosophy does not finish in concepts that it can and must lead towards realities. He also correlates the empty space to a dynamic and controversial interpretation of St. Thomas. Quote, the desire of vision, of possession of the divine, of beatitude, a desire that every intellect is belabored by in essence, but at the same time remains inevitably inefficacious without the gratuitous aid of the supernatural gift. Central to Blondel's positive project is a distinction between states of human being united in concrete reality. And here's a set of 5. 1, a state of nature that actually could subsist, but also actually has never existed for humanity in the historical and concrete order. 2, the state of original justice. 3, the state of decay. 4, a transnatural state in which by the redemption there is revocation, renewed call, solicitations of grace that do not leave a person in his or her interior equilibrium, but that do not yet constitute the life of grace. And lastly, 5, the state in which a person is introduced into the supernatural order. Each of these states is a potential object and field of investigation for philosophy, so that for philosophy, even in its most autonomous spontaneity, there is a possibility or obligation to correspond in some way to these differing states. 3 different broad philosophical projects, each one a part of Christian philosophy, arranged in successive stages, correspond to these states. First, corresponding to the state of nature, essential philosophy systematically examines necessary and possible conditions and structures of human thought and action. At this stage, philosophy can and does become critically aware of its own insufficiencies, including this desiderium naturale and inefficax at the same time, which reason would consider it unreasonable either to deny or to claim to satisfy. A congenital and essential disposition, the ineffaceable mark of every finite intellect, even the highest, of every contingent will, even the most powerful. At this point, human reason is brought to recognition, opening, and orientation towards the empty space, but not yet to determinately entering it. Determinately entering and exploring the empty space involves a second philosophical project, a sort of, as he calls it, mixed philosophy of the possible relations between essential possibilities or necessities and realizable contingents. At this next stage, philosophy begins to address more determinate questions and to become more concrete. He says, yes or no, does this place which opens to the intervention of what alone can fill and fulfill the creature remain empty? Or rather, is it in reality occupied, and by what? And if it is occupied, by what method, to what degree, with what gain? Does reason's gaze bear upon the secret guest and show one, the welcome to give him, the cooperation to contribute to him? This philosophical project readies philosophy to extend itself fully to the concrete realities of human historical existence, to the triune God, and the relations entangling the human subject and other human subjects with God. At this stage, while entering the empty space, philosophy still maintains a critical reserve, not so much towards the determinately Christian supernatural order as towards philosophy's own adequacy to the plenitude of reality now open to and addressing it. In the third philosophical project, philosophy engages what Christianity teaches to be humanity's and all other created beings' real condition. At this stage, it becomes possible to, quote, study the repercussions in natural man of the different states, transnatural, supernatural, or rebel, that awaken in consciousness and the will data or reactions other than those of a pure state of nature. 2 last points about this third philosophical project are worth noting. First, the philosophizing human subject is implicated within these concrete states, not as an object of disinterested and detached study by a subject whose own condition does not in any way affect their ability or even willingness to grasp and understand them. Second, this project of real philosophy involves recuperation of the type of Christian philosophy Gilson and Maritain articulated. What Blondel insists on as its necessary correlate are the self-critical safeguards that an open philosophy, a philosophy of insufficiency, provides. He cautions, without what we have called this sanitatio in radite, the development of Christian philosophy is compromised, or even speaking truthfully, the entire organism of autonomous philosophy risks being dangerously intoxicated and sterilized. Next subsection, the problem of Catholic philosophy. The 1933 Société d'études philosophiques session afforded Blondel an opportunity to further articulate his position and engage interlocutors. He re-emphasizes that conceptualism and historicism render a historical solution to the problem of Christian philosophy, as well as contemporary reappropriation of past Christian philosophies, philosophically untenable, and distinguishes three conceptions or projects of Christian philosophy deficient, so long as these metaphilosophical assumptions hold sway, but recuperable from the perspective afforded by a philosophy of insufficiency. First, there are the truths that philosophy and Christian doctrine can both attain. The latter assists insofar as it confirms them, provides them precision, and expands them by purifying them from doubts, troubles, and errors. Second, there are truths that reason was not able to discover through its own activity and powers, but that were contributed by Christianity, then offering to speculation a gripping point, enabling extension and growth for rational thought itself. Third, Christianity modified and nourished the culture of the West as a whole, little by little penetrating the entire intellectual civilization and its intellects, leading to the critical situation of modernity, which, as once again Blondel stresses, both makes fully possible and requires rethinking the problem of Christian philosophy in modernity by bringing the always looming crisis between rational autonomy and Christian demands to a vital point. Here I'm going to read footnote 182. A year earlier, in his pseudonymously published article in Philosophie chrétienne et rationnement concevable, Blondel explains why the historical condition of modernity imposes new conditions on and brings new opportunities for Christian philosophy. He writes, "We can no longer allow such a question to fall back into the ambiguities and approximations with which people seem to have been hitherto contented. So long as societies and human beings still lived off of even secularized acquisitions and in an atmosphere penetrated by Christian contributions, it was possible to avoid a more radical examination of the very grounds of our civilization. But prodigious transformations are carried out in every domain and call again into question all speculative or practical principles. And already the revolutionary era we're traversing affirms constructive and organic claims systematically alien or hostile to all the intellectual, moral, and spiritual traditions of yesterday's world. From that point on, compromise and mere continuance are no longer sufficient. It's a matter of envisioning the conflict between the Christian conception of the universe, of society, of human destiny, and the new program that is offered just as much to the intellectual elite as to popular aspirations. Do we understand through this the vital interest assumed by fundamental study of the reasons that can and must connect the highest philosophical speculation and Christianity's very cause?" All right, back to the section. What has been only partially carried out and needs to be carried further is, quote, making the very conception of philosophy evolve into one in which the problem of the supernatural is determined in all of its precision by a rational critique that shows its legitimacy and inevitability. This entails an option similar to that posed earlier between conceptualism and an open philosophy, this time between a philosophy that can suffice unto itself, suffice to all of reality and to its human subjects, and an affirmation of the legitimacy, the reality, the indestructible originality of positive religions, thought, and life in the heart of humanity. Blondel provides several important clarifications in addressing his interlocutors. He agrees with Devolvé's critique of superstitiously hypostatized understandings of reason, fact, and revelation, but affirms the intrinsic value and the original nature of human reason. Maréchal suggests that Blondel's Christian philosophy and Thomism meet in raising the problem of a natural desire underlying all human thought and being for the supernatural. This natural desire is confused, is not immediately apparent, and can be discerned only by an indirect method. It also cannot be achieved by and through itself and its means, though it can be by grace, but it does open the possibility of the supernatural order. Blondel responds that philosophy in its activity can reveal such a, quote, aspiration and nostalgia, congenital and constitutive in every spiritual creature. This penetrates and motivates the philosophical activity of the human subject, and in humanity's concrete and historical state, the positive calling and the interior or exterior stimulations, rendering it obligatory, decisive, and accessible, are added to this order of necessary possibility. Correlatively, however, this engagement and assimilation of the concrete and historical requires the preliminary and critical state of open philosophy. In his discussion with Palliard and Berger, Blondel adds that the natural desire for the supernatural and the supernatural's order's approach or calling necessarily remains marked by ambiguity, requiring, quote, a work of the soul and of reason, as well as the realization that the desired transcendence cannot be derived from the human subject. He also amplifies the theme of the empty space, expanding his terminology so that infinitesimal and real fissures riddle human thought, holes, gaps requiring another reality, that of the supernatural. Philosophical thought and Christian thought thus reciprocally insert themselves into each other's interstices so that no simple dividing line between philosophy and theology, reason and faith exists, but rather interpenetration without confusion. Next section, towards an integral philosophy. In this 1934 piece, Blondel both responds to von Steenbergen and further elucidates several aspects of his own position. He rejects the neo-scholastic suggested philosophy of Christianity as philosophical reflection on Christianity, deliberately carried out from an intrinsic perspective. It would fail to respect both the specifically divine character of Christianity and the completely human character of philosophy. Either this would produce a separated philosophy, or it would fall into the historicist dilemma of rationalizing Christianity or bringing a heterogeneous and unassimilated supernatural into philosophy. Blondel proposes the alternative of maintaining an, quote, essential incommensurability between the Christian order and the philosophical order. While recognizing that philosophy can prepare dispositions required so that access to the invisible soul of the church remains open to all, so that it keeps ready and free the place of waiting or possession that only Christianity deserves and fills. He specifies that philosophy insufficiency must take its bearings not from abstract disciplinary distinctions of philosophy and theology, but from the living thought that animates philosophy and sets it within a drama. Blondel also argues that von Steenbergen inconsistently calls for philosophy to extend itself to all the real, but then restricts it to the domain of concepts, of essences, of possibilities, of metaphysical necessities, preventing philosophy from engaging itself in concrete reality that exceeds this domain. In Blondel's view, this relapse into conceptualism stems from failure to see in the insufficiency of philosophy with respect to what lies beyond it a positive state, the expression of a presence, of a power, of a duty, of our thought interiorly belabored by a very real aspiration, by a historically set up vocation, or even by a stimulating and undeclinable grace. In place of broad theology, Blondel proposes a broadened philosophy, a sort of summa, a philosophy extending to all of the real, including the soul of the church and humanity's ultimate end, a philosophy structured in three progressive stages, corresponding to those articulated in Le Problème de la Philosophie Catholique. The first metaphysical stage opens the empty space within philosophy by examining the conditions necessary for human existence and for human beings to have a destiny. In the second stage, philosophy, now conscious of its insufficiency both to limit itself and to attain all its objects, considers whether access to the supernatural and the response to philosophy's own insufficiency has not already been gratuitously and historically provided, whether the empty space is not already filled. Philosophy engages Christianity determinately at this stage, but as a mystery. In the third phase, philosophy, having in the previous two grasped what Blondel calls the metaphysical and spiritual armature that sustains the ascensions of the Christian order, penetrates further into the Christian mystery and determinate, concrete, lived Christian life. This broad philosophy is what Blondel means by Catholic philosophy, and responding to von Steenbergen's advocation not of a Christian philosophy, but of a true philosophy, he argues that a true philosophy will be the open philosophy he has described. All right, so last subsection of this section, Office de Philosophie, du philosophe, rather. In this 1936 article, Blondel responds to the question put to him by the board of the Revue Thomiste: what does the attitude, the specific mindset, the professional duty of the philosopher consist in, insofar as his research must be specified in the presence of the theologian's teachings on truths, where they both must meet each other while retaining a formal autonomy? Interestingly, in this piece, he brings his position closer to Gilson's and Maritain's positions when discussing ways in which Christianity and Christian theology productively communicate with philosophy. First, however, he analogizes the philosopher to a climber ascending an immense staircase leading up a mountain whose perspective necessarily differs from that of the theologian, likened to an aviator who views the itinerary from above. The philosopher must be continually attentive to the fieri, the becoming of truth in himself, corresponding to the vertical faces of the steps, so as better to know it such as it is in itself, in its esse being, which the theologian is enabled to see from on high. Blondel then distinguishes three situations of communication between philosophy and theology. The first involves metaphysical or moral truths common to the two disciplines, and ideally an agreement that works itself out, not at all by abdication, superposition, or substitution, but by singularly salutary and pacifying compenetration, conformation, and precision. The second involves truths philosophy did not and was not able to attain to on its own, stemming from revealed mysteries, and philosophy's role in this case is to, quote, draw from it some information, some clarity for the mind whose weak gaze can still take advantage of an indirect light. While philosophy cannot naturalize these truths, reducing them to philosophical concepts, and must respect their supernatural origin and status, it can at least meditate upon them. In order to find there a meaning to some degree illuminated or illuminating. The third deals with the historical and contingent data, the dogmatic facts that surround the mysteries about which we have just spoken, but that also express divine charity's unpredictable and unfathomable interventions. Here, Blondel counsels, while maintaining a critical reserve, the philosopher must avoid two erroneous attitudes. He must refrain from transforming what is the foundational and constitutive reality of the supernatural order into mythic inventions, into symbolic projection of more obscure needs of ascetic or mystical sentimentality. He also must not ignore or seem to ignore the totality of major Christian events by treating them as if they were only simple contingent details among the diverse facts of which the world is composed. Since the philosopher's mission is to, quote, neglect nothing of concrete and complete reality, both speculative and practical, remaining faithful to philosophy's own demands requires not only observing these points, but thematizing them within one's philosophical activity and system. So that is the end of the Blondel section. Then we have Gabriel Marcel, who will be taking up next reading. We're going to be doing readings every Thursday during this month from Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, which will get us to the end of the introduction and then prepare us for the larger work of starting to read the actual translations from Brehier, Gilson, Blondel, Marcel, Born, Sertillange, de Solage, von Steenbergen, and Noel. So I'm looking forward to that. If you have any questions or comments about the ideas that we've talked about the debates in general, about the figures or issues, I'm happy to entertain them. We have about 20 minutes, so I can take those now. Otherwise, I'm happy to end the session early, and we'll do another one next week, Thursday, talking about Gabriel Marcel and about Thomist opponents of Christian philosophy, right? The neo-scholastic Thomist opponents of Christian philosophy. As a matter of fact, by the end of the month, we will get to Emile Brehier's Is There a Christian Philosophy, which I've translated for this. While I'm waiting to see if there's any interesting questions or comments, I'll mention that. I'll tell you a little bit of story. So many of you know that I was in a faculty fellowship with Alistair McIntyre back in 2005 at the University of Notre Dame over the summer. And one of the things, we each had to present something on our current research. So I presented about this. And then afterwards, he came up to me and he's like, I don't know if you want to have this, but here's something for you. And he handed me a document in a folder. And it was his translation of Emile Brehier's Is There a Christian Philosophy, which was one of the central documents early on in the debate. He had translated it for a student. And he said, you can, do whatever you want with this. Look it over. I know you've already got your own translation, but maybe you'd like to compare it. And I was like, well, thanks. Yeah, that's really cool. And so I did look it over. We were actually pretty close on how he translated a lot of stuff. So that was always quite nice. Capricious, reason was the revelation. I will leave it at that. Thanks again. Love your efforts and work. Reason is one of those things. It's an easy word to say. It's a very complicated phenomenon within us that is determinative of us and of philosophy. And any simple generalization about reason, is both a product of reason and likely to also be wrong about what reason is. Does this get into any phenomenology, or was it before it really got going with Heidegger? Phenomenology did not get going with Heidegger. Phenomenology got going with a whole host of people. Heidegger was one of them. Before Heidegger, of course, there was Husserl and Max Scheler, equally important to Husserl and to Heidegger. Gabriel Marcel is a phenomenologist. There were phenomenologists in France. And there's a really great dissertation by Christian Dupont that shows that what paved the way for phenomenology to make its way into French philosophy was Henri Bergson with his attention to the immediate data of consciousness, another way of talking about phenomenology, and guess who? Maurice Blondel from Axion 1893 with his method of immanence. So phenomenology does not play an important role within the debate. As I mentioned in previous sessions, reading from it, there are some people discussing phenomenology who play minor roles within the debate. You could look at Edith Stein, who was the invited guest at the first Société Thomiste session, right? And she's got later works discussing the problem of Christian philosophy. Léon Noël, the very last entry that I translated, he is using Husserlian phenomenology to argue against there being a Christian philosophy. Dom Foiling at the Société Thomiste, the second session, which is not translated in this volume, also talked about phenomenology. Jean-Luc Marion is much, 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 much later and actually has an article on the Christian philosophy debates where he gets most of the people he talks about wrong, but that's not entirely surprising about Marion. Marion's an interesting guy. I've met him. I've actually had dinner with him at one point. And he's, you get a Marion, he's sort of like Deleuze, right? You know what you're dealing with, or Kojève. It's when he talks about other people, you're getting Marion's take on that, and it's very interesting, but it's often not all that close to the original. So yeah, Marion would be much, much later. There are, in fact, a lot of French phenomenologists who are closer to the time. This is the 1930s, who have a few things to say about it. Merleau-Ponty actually writes about it in Signs, but gets things about the debates wrong. But he's aware of the debates. I don't know if Levinas was all that tuned into it. But yeah, that's a good point. All right, any other questions, comments, issues people want to bring up? I'll mention too, Mario came down to Southern Illinois when I was a graduate student there, and we got to, he did a couple presentations. He and I had a couple interactions outside of the classroom, because I was sort of at the cusp point of like, I was like finishing my dissertation, and I was also, Francophone. So he liked having somebody who he could talk to. And then I saw him a couple times up at the Lumen Christi events up in Chicago. Didn't make the Franciscan University Steubenville conference that was devoted to him, because I think I was down in North Carolina at the time, maybe. But yeah, there's actually quite a lot of contemporary work on Blondel these days in French, not so much in English. The English-speaking world tends to be, when it comes to these figures, tends to be, if anybody knows them, dominated by Gilson and Maritain, because their stuff got translated a long time ago, Byron, and this might be for later, but do come to a decision. Is there a Christian philosophy? There are Christian philosophies. There is not one single model of Christian philosophy. And that's one of the things that the debates showed, and is also reflected in the Fides et Ratio document from John Paul II, which is highly inspired by Blondel, as people have pointed out, that there isn't a Christian philosophy singular. There is rather a whole set of interconnected ones. Stuart, excuse my ignorance, would Camus have been aware, interested in these debates, and as an existentialist? No, not really. Camus didn't have any interest in this sort of stuff. And Camus is, pretty straightforward about his atheism. There's just a lot of things he doesn't take seriously. And to be fair, a lot of the Catholics that he, interacted with were kind of sanctimonious pricks. So why would he be? These guys weren't, but yeah. There were a lot of Christian existentialists who were involved in these, and also in the 1940s to 50s Reformed Christian debates that came later, but they're kind of minor figures, and they're not ones that got into the big pantheon of Sartre, de Beauvoir, Camus, and the precursors. Existentialism was a much broader movement than people often realize. It included people like Léon Chestov, who did take part in the debates in the very end, writing the first essays in Revue de Métaphysique et Morale that would later turn into his book Athens and Jerusalem. But he was kind of late to the game. And Gilson and Maritain are often called existentialist Thomists. Blondel's philosophy was in communication with and had a lot of same concerns with existentialism. Marcel is, of course, viewed as an existentialist. He's the first person to use the term existentialiste in French, long before Camus or Sartre or any of those people are doing so. But he then abandons the term after Sartre kind of takes over the territory. So yeah. All right. Well, this is a good set of questions, and I'm glad you could join me here for the reading. I think I'll bring it to a close since I don't see any other questions. We'll do these every Thursday this month. Probably continue on as long. It's going to be a while getting through a book this long, but if we do it like 10 to 15 pages at a time, we will eventually do it. Maybe by the end of the year. So I'll see all of you next time, and. Keep reading, keep thinking, and keep studying philosophy.